Well, here we are again, and I realized when somebody had sent me a remark about that little Funsies engine repair test that I sent, that question number 3 didn't have a highlighted answer on the answer part of it. I don't know how in the world that got past me, but I figured I'd go ahead and cover that right here. The question was, Joe was checking the cranks but no start in a timing belt equipped vehicle with coil packs and finds no ignition spark. He can hear the fuel pump kick on for 2 seconds, at 2 seconds with the key on, but it doesn't continue to run with the engine cranking, which is the least likely to be the cause. That could be this, it could be this, it could be, and the reason I'm saying it could be the timing belt was because I have seen multiple times when the timing belt, even if the crank sensor is basically right there, if the crank sensor is in that same area, when the timing belt comes off, sometimes it will go smacking around there and destroy the crank sensor. So there could be a problem, but that was caused by a break-in timing belt that would destroy the crank sensor. So it could be that the crank sensor itself could be the problem. The PCM power feed is not likely to be the problem, although, you know, that's a sort of iffy, depending on the vehicle you're talking about. Contaminated fuel is not likely to be the problem either. The PCM power feed, the crank sensor, the timing belt, you know, and the reason I say PCM power feed, that was a sort of a screwed up answer anyway. If that thing is kicking the fuel pump on and running for 2 seconds, the PCM power feed, depending on the system, might or might not be the problem. So that's a sort of a screwy question. It wouldn't pass muster as an ASE question, but one way or another, that's what we were after right there. Anyway, I want to talk about how the Tempo was replaced by the Contour in 1995. I got a couple of Contour stories here, and that's one of the reasons I was telling you about that. Of course, Contour is really very similar to a Mazda 626 back in those days. But this was the car. This is an actual photo of my wife's 93 Tempo, the one I bought her brand new. And it was back in the late, either it was early in 94, I think. It was one sitting on the lot from the previous year. We got a really good deal on it because it was a rebate and everything else. In case you haven't ever seen this word here before, succedaneum is another word for substitute, or for replacement or whatever. Okay, so I was introduced to the Tempo, which was Contour's predecessor in the late 1983 when they were brand new, and front-wheel drive cars weren't very prevalent in the domestic lines before then. You just didn't see all that many of them. And I know particularly in the Ford and Lincoln Mercury line. But I went to work at the Lincoln Mercury dealership in the big town over, about 30 miles from here back then. I had worked at the Volkswagen dealer, but I left the Volkswagen dealer to go to the Lincoln Mercury place for a higher way. I think back in 83 at the Volkswagen place, I was getting $8 a flat rate hour, and they were paying 12 a flat rate hour, which was pretty good back then in this part of the country, back over there at the Lincoln Mercury place. And so they asked me if I would mind helping them with the front wheel drive cars because the older mechanics didn't like them. They wanted me to do transmissions, they wanted me to do electronics, and so I told them I could handle all of that. And so I went over there, and then I was introduced to this Tempo, and I thought that thing was a very interesting car. Now, it was kind of built along the lines of the Escort. The Escort came out 2 or 3 years before that. And of course, the guys that were working there, the older guys that were used to the old kind of cars, didn't like that either. I mean, they didn't like any of the front-wheel drive cars, to tell you the truth. But I didn't mind them, a car is a car and all that. But this is the different engine packages that were available in the Tempo. Of course, that one there, that diesel, was also available in the Escort. And it was a, high RPM diesel, kind of like the ones in the Rabbits. It turned 5,500 RPM, that kind of thing. Got incredible fuel economy. That's a Japanese diesel. And this one here is the 2.3 liter HSC TBI, throttle body injection. The earliest Tempos, the very first year that they came out, they had carburetors on them because they couldn't produce the TBI units fast enough for whatever reason. I don't know. At least that's what we were told at school. Some of those, as time went on, they started putting 3 liters. Now, the 3 liter was a sort of a, the 3 liter was basically the same engine as you had in a Taurus, but it didn't have as much horsepower as the one that they put in the, the Tauruses and all. And then you had this high, HSC, that's high swirl combustion. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. SFI unit that came out. In other words, it was sequential, still had a distributor, but in addition to that distributor, it had a cam sensor in the block because it was sequential fuel injection instead of the TBI. But those are the four major engine packages that they had in there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this little engine. This is not the same 2.3 that was in the old Pintos, that old engine that got the overhead cam and all that you see in Ford Rangers and all that kind of stuff. This was a different engine, but I really liked the design of this engine a lot better than that other. Now that other 2.3 liter / 2.5, like they had in the pickups, even in the Rangers up in the 2000s, they had that six-cylinder, that straight four, that I4 engine that was a 2.3 and then a 2.5. That thing was tough as nails. That's one guy that was a student that I had a 2006 Ranger, and I'm not kidding you, this is a true story. This guy got some nitrous and a water hose and hooked it up so that he just stuck that water hose in the intake. And this guy was a sort of he was just kind of a street racer. They go to a back parade, and this wasn't all that many years ago either. And he was using that nitrous in that little 2006 Ranger, to give it a boost so he could win some races against these other guys that were racing these muscle cars. And he really surprised them. And he just had a big valve and that water hose going in there. And he raced that thing again and again and again and again. And he knew he was damaging the thing. And he says, I just knew that that thing was going to come apart a long time before it did. It eventually just exploded on the inside because he was overdoing it. And I actually was there. We pulled the motor out, and I've got a picture of us somewhere pulling the motor out of it and tearing it apart. It was really kind of funny because his mother called me and she says, can you look at that engine when you guys get it out and get it torn down and tell me if he was abusing it? And he was listening to the phone conversation. I said, yeah, I can look at it and tell if he was doing that. And he was like, oh, is that right? Yeah. He really didn't want me reporting to his mother what he'd been doing, but he actually destroyed that one with nitrous, but it stayed together a heck of a long time. Well, this one here is tough as all get out too, but it's a totally different engine than the other one. Now this thing right here has got the timing chain in the block like a V8, except it's a four-cylinder. It's like half of a V8 basically, and it's a pushrod engine, which is I kind of like those because I got kind of used to them. High swirl combustion. Whenever the air came in there, the combustion chamber was set up so it would swirl around and it would get really good flame propagation there at the spark plug area. And they went from carburetor to TBI to SFI. But that's a sort of a cutaway of it I found online. I thought that was a really a nice little picture of that. But also, something else you might want to pay attention to, the intake and the exhaust are on the same side. It's not a cross flow head. It comes in and goes back out, on the same side. So the intake and the exhaust are kind of mixed together there. Now there was a brace that was hooked to this boss right here that was going down there to the block on the early ones. We'll talk about that again in a second. Now I saw one tempo, and I'm not kidding, this girl had it was back, you might remember that there was a time when Ford did not have a check engine light, but they did have a red engine light that would come on if your oil pressure or your engine temperature wobbled out of line. So when that red engine light come on, it was supposed to alarm you to the point that you would get something seen about. Well, this girl was driving this tempo, and it was one of the old TBI units, and this thing, she said, this red light comes on, and she said, I was down in Florida, she lived down there just south of Florida line, which is not far from here, and she says, and I went to a shop I always use down there, and they said not to pay any attention to that light because it's not a big deal. They thought that red light was the check engine light, which on GM cars, they felt like you could just ignore it and keep driving it. Well, what they didn't realize was she was actually seeing that red light because that thing was overheating. And she said it would quit and stop beside the road, and she would let it cool off for a while, and then she would crank it up and she'd drive on. And just talking to her, she said it had been doing that for about a month. And man, I don't know how many times, 30, 40, 50 times, that thing had been so hot that it had literally quit running beside the road. Okay, so I got it into my service bay, the cooling system was completely clogged up with mud because somebody had put just clear water in it. They didn't put antifreeze in there, they put clear water in there, and it stayed in there long enough to where it started to rust the inside of the block. These were subject to that. If you didn't service the cooling system, these tempo cooling systems would really get loaded with rust. And this one here was an extreme case of that. That thermostat on that tempo had got so hot when I pulled it out of there that it had literally turned blue, like you had blued a gun barrel or something. This thing was really amazing. And I actually took the radiator off. You know, I think that radiator may have been brass and copper, and I had it rotted out at the local radiator shop or something, or I might have just replaced the radiator. Flushed all of that rusty crap out of there, and I put the coolant back in there like it was supposed to be and all that. And that son of a gun it never blew a gasket. It didn't detemper the rings like you expect it to do on one that gets that hot. Totally amazing. Now the counterpart to this engine that was in some of your little Chevys of this size, like the Citation or whatever they were, that doggone thing, if you overheated one of those once and they had a cast iron head, it would warp the head and the engine was toast. This thing right here got really, really, really hot so many times, it was just blew me away. There was another one that we worked on that had a noise in the transmission because of there was some bearings that come apart in the transmission on the transmission output, and there was a ball that was against the transmission oil pan, and the park pawl was, you know, if you know the ring gear all spin really close to the lower oil pan, you know, the valve body's on the top on these transmissions that are in these things. We had to put a transmission in it. Well, after we put the transmission in it, and it quit making all that racket that the transmission was making, we realized at that point that the engine was knocking a little bit. So we went ahead and dropped the pan off of it. It was like a 94 model, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And that was when I was working in college. And it was an old car by that time, 7, 8 years old, had a lot of miles on it. We took that thing apart and we took the rod bearings loose from the crankshaft. And we mic'd the crankshaft and compared it to factory specs, and it was factory specs. It had not worn a bit, even though the bearing was starting to wear out. And so we went ahead and put a set of bearings in that thing, and we fixed that engine knock for $65 or something. Of course, in the college, we didn't charge any labor, but we also didn't guarantee anything. So that was the double-edged sword. We didn't guarantee anything, but we didn't charge any labor either. But anyway, we fixed the transmission and we fixed the engine, and you know, she had basically dodged a bullet on that engine knock because of the fact that usually when the bearing's worn out enough to where the engine's knocking, the crankshaft is not going to mic standard. But we plastic gauged it and the oil clearances were good, and so we went ahead and put that one back together. Sometimes you don't know what you can get away with until you try it. The early 84 models, oil was leaking from the front of the head gasket pushrod area, and replacing the gasket paid 3.5 hours. There was a program that came out. They didn't want to kill this car with an oil leak that was coming out from under the head gasket. And I figured out a way to do it right in 45 minutes. Right here is where it was leaking. And they had put a gasket on there that was just a gasket. They didn't have any glue or anything on it. And for some reason or another, the place, you know, where the push rods go down through there, it didn't have a plate on the side of it like the old 6-cylinders did. But right there is where that thing was leaking oil from between the head and the block right there. And they wanted all those head gaskets replaced to fix that oil leak, and it was all those vehicles until a brand new platform. Well, the first one I did, I went ahead and just pulled the head completely off of it. And I was thinking, wow, this is really a lot of work. But they paid 3.5 hours or something like that, whatever it was. And so I says, they hit, and that was at the Lincoln Mercury deal. They had a I-beam with a chain fall, you know, on a trolley rolling across there. And I figured out that I could roll that thing over there, and I could hook that chain fall to that cylinder head, and I could unhook that brace on the back of the cylinder head. And something else that was interesting about this engine is there were no dowels. There were absolutely no dowels, and they figured they didn't need dowels because the head was cast iron and the block was cast iron, and it wasn't slanted, so you could just set the head straight back down on there. You know, dowels basically keep the engine, like when you see dowels where the engine and the transmission hook together, that's basically to keep them from moving because of expansion and contraction of the different kinds of metal, so that they loosen up the bolts. Also, there's all that torquing going on. On this one here, they figured, well, we don't need any dowels, so they didn't put any in there. And so what I was able to do on these, because there was no glue on the gasket of any kind, and the engines were almost brand new at the time, I would hook a chain fall to that thing, and I would take all the bolts out and take the little brace off the back, and I could raise that cylinder head up about 1.5 to 2 inches, and that head gasket would slide out of there like a business card. And then I would feel my hand all the way under that head and all the way over the block to feel if there was anything that needed to be cleaned off under there. And there never was back then. Now, the gasket we put back in there had tacky. It was a blue gasket with tacky stuff on both sides of it. And it was a little thicker than the original gasket. And so I would slide that in there and I'd get it in place. But what I did was I cut some head bolts off that I had. And so that they were just only about, you know, they would stick up about that far, and I cut a slotted hole in the top of the head, you know, not a slotted hole, but a slot with a hacksaw, high-speed cutter, I don't remember what I used. But anyway, I screwed that down in there, and I'd use that kind of like dowels. And so I'd put the head gasket on, boom, that would hold the head gasket in place, and I'd lower the cylinder head back down, and then it would be sitting on those dowels, and then I could reach down there with a long screwdriver and screw that piece of a head bolt back out, and then lift it out there with a magnet, put all the head bolts in, torque them down. They weren't even, you know, they didn't even need to be torqued to yield because you had a cast iron head and a cast iron block. That was what was so cool about that. I figured out how to do that right in 45 minutes, and I made a lot of money on those things because I did all of them that came in because them other mechanics didn't want to fool with them. And so I managed to rake me in a lot of cash doing that kind of thing. So this is kind of what it looks like, you know. They even talk about using guide bolts here on that. They don't need to be that long necessarily. I just cut them real short, and I'd put them in there so that when you set it down, you know, it would just drop over them. Then you could go down and get them out like that. Anyway, they're 11 millimeter, 1.5 thread pitch bolts, you know, that's what they are. So anyway, all right, say goodbye to my little friend and hello to this thing. This is the Contour. Introduced to the Contour. Appeared to be a close cousin of the Mazda 626, and it was a whole new car, and I didn't like it. I liked the tempo, but I did not like this car. Now, it was the first one that had a cabin air filter, and there was a couple other things. It also had the variable valve timing on the exhaust camshaft, so it would close the valves a little early and trap some of the exhaust gas in there, and it would do that instead of having EGR. Now, not every engine, even back then, had EGR on it. Some of your 2.9 liter Broncos didn't have EGR because they could satisfy emission requirements without an EGR valve. Now, some of them you see an OEM plate that was bolted where the EGR went because they just didn't require to have EGR. I mean, they didn't have to have EGR in that particular model year to satisfy NOx requirements. Well, everything seemed to be wrong about it. For one, the shop manual procedures for the 2 liter engine that was in this car, the Z-Tech, call for the removal of the catalytic converter to replace the PCV valve. Who in the world does something like that? All right, this Z-Tech with dual overhead camshaft, 4 valves per cylinder, and aluminum cylinder head, and sequential fuel injection seemed pretty reliable, but with some peculiar idiosyncrasies. There was stuff that you didn't expect on this. Now, it was dual overhead cam. All right. This one here holds the distinction of being the first vehicle, and I mentioned this earlier, with a cabin air filter. And it basically would get, and some of the Tauruses right after that had cabin air filters in them that would stop anything bigger than 20 or 25 microns. And it became, that's the variable cam timing. And that thing there, it basically had a helical gear that it would run in and out. When you run that helical gear in and out, it would change the relationship between the gear and the camshaft. Instead of having a cam phaser, that helical gear had a piston that moved it. You know how helical gear does. When you move it, it changes the angle. And that was carefully done. They did that, you know, with oil pressure too. So Z-Tech was used on cars for about 10 years and even found a home in the Escape Hybrid. It went actually beyond that. And, you know, that's a nice little new picture of that. Now, on the like on the 05 Escapes, to locate the crankshaft, there's a pin you got to put in there from the back side to hold the crankshaft in place while you're, you know, timing it and everything, which is not a lot different from this one here. You still have to do a pin on this one too. If it didn't have any compression, this is one of the ones I talked about before, that whenever the dealer would have some of these that were on their used car lot, they would move them from place to place over and over, and they would wind up washing the cylinder walls down because it's on cold enrichment when you're just moving it from one parking place to another, which is a terrible thing to do to any car. You know, you do that very much, you're going to wind up with so much sludge in there, you're going to ruin everything anyway. So basically, you're going to, and they don't want to run it long enough to burn much gas out of it because they got to put the gas back in it at their expense at the used car place. But anyway, they would find one, they'd have one that with these low tension piston rings, when you wash the cylinder walls down, it will just spin. Like occasionally it would be because the idle air control would stick shut. And you know, it's supposed to give you no touch starting, but if it sticks shut, you get a bunch of double pulsed injector shots in there, and it won't start, and it washes the cylinder walls down. And I would get them out there, and I said, well, this sounds like it's out of time. But whenever you pull the cover off and look, it's perfectly in time. Just needed a squirt of oil in each cylinder, spin it over until that oil gets, you know, build some compression up, and then it would fire up and all that. So 100% blow by on these low, it's because of the low tension rings is what it was. The older ones, when the cylinders were dry, you might have noticed on one that's been sitting in a barn, if it's an old V8 and the cylinder walls are dry, it spins over really, really slowly because the cylinder walls are so dry. You know, and these right here don't do that. They go, they do that. So the young guy helped pull the ticket on 195 contour that had come to us from a small town in Florida. I was over there after I went to the college. I'd go over to the Fordplex and I'd help them every now and then just so I could keep up with what was going on at the time. Somebody had popped a salvage yard engine in that car, but couldn't get it started. They dragged it to the local Ford dealer where the timing belt was replaced, but they still couldn't get it to start. So the compression sounded decent. I always like to listen to the compression. If I'm listening to one, you can hear one out there in the parking lot. If somebody's spinning it over, it goes, you know, if the piston, one of the pistons picked up speed because they ain't squeezing no air, you can say, well, one of those cylinders got low compression. And then if it's skipping, you don't even need to do a compression test unless you want to pinpoint the cylinder. You know one of them's got a burnt valve or something. When you turn the wheels to the right for access and remove the splash shield, I connected a timing light. I like to do that even on one you can't set the timing on. I connected a timing light to #1 plug wire and watched the timing light flash while he spun the engine. And the spark was happening about 30 degrees late, which I thought was odd. This set of circumstances confused some of the engine guys that claimed the cam gears had to be out of time, but I says that just doesn't wash because he had already checked the belt timing, and secondly, the crank sensor used by the EDIS ignition module on this one gets its signal from the flywheel, which it couldn't care less where the valves are. So we're basically getting the crank signal from the flywheel, and we basically also are looking at it over here, and we're seeing that it's out of time. Okay, this crank sensor it's way back here on this, right back there in that housing, and it provides base time and engine speed information to the EDIS module, and that supplies information to the PCM as the profile ignition pickup, and that uses that for fuel injector timing and calculating ignition timing and so on and so forth. That's one of these modules here. They didn't use those all that many years. For example, Crown Victoria used that just 1 year, and that was in '05. And so what happened there was that EDIS was something, it was just a flash in the pan. They used it on some of the 4 liters. They never used it on the 3 liter. They used it on the 4 liters. And they used it on Ford Rangers, even the ones with the 4 cylinders in them. Well, let's see, no, they didn't either. The Ford Rangers had that DIS on it that had that double-sided, you know, 6-pin module over there mounted too. Well, you can forget that stuff if you haven't been in it for a long time, can't you? But anyway, so this is the little teeth that are machined into the flywheel. Somebody had put the flywheel on the engine wrong, and at the very least the transmission would have to be removed to look at the flywheel alignment. Now, I will tell you that some of the people, you know, I always make sure like to put all these bolts on there. If somebody's in a big hurry and they pop that thing on there wrong, then they're liable to just put the bolts in that will line up and forget about the other ones. I don't know what they did, but something happened and this wasn't lined up right. See, there's your missing tooth. Each one of these are 10 degrees apart, and there's your missing tooth. That's how it's able to tell. Now, this is a strange thing. We went out there to another vehicle. It was a different contour. And it had come in on the hook. He spun it over. Some of the cylinders had more compression than others, and it was a 138,000 mile vehicle, so a timing belt would probably be in order. So we jerked the 2 bolts to hold the top tip of the timing cover in place. We found a fresh looking timing belt which would whirl the gears when the key was turned, but it was pretty loose. You know, you watch, I like to see if it'll spin the gear. Sometimes if you pull that cover off where you can see the top of the belt and you spin it over, if this ain't moving, then you know the timing's stripped on the bottom. All right, pull the valve cover off. To access the camshaft, we had to put this little blade in there. These slots are offset, so it will only fit one way, right? And I think I'm mentioning this in a minute. The Volkswagen Rabbit is like that with its single camshaft on the diesels and the gas burners, but it only had one camshaft. So this is something that you're basically not using timing marks to line up the camshafts. You're actually using a tool that lines them up exactly where they're supposed to be, and it holds them rigidly right there. Now, the caveat is, here's the thing. If you ever are working on one of these and you've got that tool in there, don't think that tool is going to hold the camshaft while you loosen the cam gear bolt, because you will destroy a camshaft that way. You're basically going to break these ears off. They're not made to hold that camshaft while you're loosening those those cam gear bolts. You have to put a wrench on the flats on the camshaft to do that, or you will screw it up. Now that's the number for that timing tool. On the Volkswagen Rabbits, I got a file that I had that was almost exactly the right size, and I took it to the grinder and I ground it off a little bit, and it was perfect for those Rabbits. That way I didn't have to use a shop tool. Well, the slots wouldn't line up when we lined up the crank, right? There's the crank, it's got a little boss right there, and you line that mark up with that. So the camshafts were out of time. We jacked it up, put it on the jack stand, removed the passenger side front wheel and the splash shield, and brought the crank pulley up on TDC. Well, another look at the belt revealed all the gears were several teeth away from where they should have been. It was out of time. Well, the owner okayed a $60 timing belt and 3 hours labor because this had come apart, and you can see the balls in there. And so we removed the support brace mount and worked the bolts out of the plastic timing cover. We pulled the balancer. You can usually just grab the balancer and pull it off with your fingers like you can on some of the older Toyota Camrys and some of the Ford Escorts and that kind of thing. Removing the lower half of the timing cover, these balls we found at the bottom, that's why we wound up with, the best way to go when you're going to do that. Some of these kits that they sell at the parts store come with a water pump, all of the pulleys, the tensioner and the timing belt and all that. So that's the best way to go, just replace all that stuff. Even if you're just putting a timing belt on it, though, you need to be feeling of your, if that timing belt spins the water pump, you need to be feeling to the water pump, spin those tensioners and the idlers and all, whatever's in there to make sure that they feel okay. And also, if it's got one of those tensioners like some of your Hondas have got, it's got that little stiff little piston in it, that thing is supposed to be really, really, really stiff. And I have seen those where you can just grab it and go clink, 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 moving in and out. And that makes a rattling noise typically rather than jumping time on those Hondas. Well, these, like I say, this is where I talked about that. And this is what I was talking about. Don't depend on this plate right here to hold them camshafts other than to keep them in place. Don't try to loosen the cam bolt that's on the other end of this whenever you're doing that. Now, this is what it looks like on both ends. Now, whenever this is lined up, there's no keyways or pins or anything here. It's kind of like on the Explorer, I talked about a couple of weeks ago, or it might have been last week, I can't remember now. But the Explorer doesn't have any keyways or anything either. It just depends on this big flat washer bolt and the torque of that bolt to keep that gear from turning. I also talked about a Ford Probe that we worked on that was set up the same way with that V6 engine it had. And so when they're lined up right, the lift end of the exhaust load, wait a minute, I lied about that. That probe was supposed to have a pin, but the pin was gone, and we actually used that same method to hold that one because it had a nice flat big washer, and we just tightened the crap out of it. Somebody else had done that before us. Anyway, if these are lined up right though on these 4 cylinders, this lobe will be pointing this way and that lobe will be pointing that way. That's typically the way that is. I always like to look at that when I get everything lined up to make sure this lobe is pointing this way and that lobe is pointing that way. Okay. Now see, there's no keyway here. You basically are just putting that in there and you're tightening it up good and strong against that. This has got a thick washer on that bolt. The torque of the bolts holds it. That's a handy way of doing this, and it makes the belt easier to install, actually. So the crank sensor, near the crank sensor, you got to pull this bolt out, and there's a special tool that you screw in there. And like I say, on the 05, even the hybrids on the 05 Ford, not the Edge, Escape, you basically have that pin. This pin is on the left side of the engine, well, actually on the front of the engine, and it's right there close. There's a crank sensor connector, and that thing goes in there. If the crankshaft is in place, this will go into a slot on one of the counterweights, and it will keep that crankshaft from moving. And that's similar to the same way that works on that Ford Escape, but this is in a different spot. You just got to look it up and make sure you're doing everything right. All right. So with everything reassembled and the new idler pulleys in place and everything on, he turned the engine, it started, ran for about 2 seconds, and it died. And he spun it again, and it sounded like there was no compression. Oh man, what the heck here? So, in one of those situations where we were both sure everything we'd done was right, but prevailing circumstances was throwing us for a loop. All right. In less than 2 minutes, the valve cover was back off. We brought it around, the camshaft slots were lined up, and everything was lined up. Everything was like it should have been. So exactly where it was supposed to be, put the valve cover back on, Donnie spun it over, and some of the cylinders started gaining compression. First one and then another began to fire, and the engine fired up and ran rough, then it smoothed out. That was a 20-mile test drive. Well, since this one have cam followers instead of hydraulic lifter, you know, sometimes hydraulic lifters on these other cars get pumped up and hold the valves open until the lifter bleeds down. When the cam stops turning on manual transmission vehicle, it jumps time, wash down cylinder walls. Turned out to be the culprit, as far as we could tell anyway. Well, one way or another, we hit that curveball out of the park. And now comes coffee time. I really appreciate you guys watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. I'm sorry I forgot to highlight the question answer on test number 3, but I needed to talk about that one a little bit anyway, just for the nature of things. Anyway, I hope you guys will come back to see me next week, and until then, have a good week.